Despite other accounts, Rodney would later insist that he never said, quote, "they took her," when referring to Carla's abductor, because he was sure that it was one person, an older individual who he believed wasn't a Western Hills student. Carla would have addressed him by name if he were. Knowing how intent the man was on killing him, Rodney had a feeling that he would never see Carla again. Over the course of the next few days, there was chaos surrounding Carla's disappearance, and Carla's parents, Leighton and Charlene, were in the centre of trying to navigate the new nightmare they found themselves in. Who would want to do this to any innocent teenager, much less Carla, who endeared herself to all who met her? The Walker residence had seen countless people come and go. Law enforcement officers were a continuous presence amid visitations of friends, well-wishers and possibly even total strangers. Among law enforcement were the FBI, the Fort Worth Police and the Benbrook Police. In the 1970s, news travelled much more slowly than it does today. A far cry from the continuous news cycles that bombard us every day through newspapers, television, computer and phone. A notable event might not reach your attention for 24 hours since its occurrence, at least until the early evening news was aired. By the end of Sunday, this is how most of the community came to hear the shocking announcement of Carla's abduction. The next day at Western Hills High School, many of the students became the subjects of questioning and scrutiny, with the Valentine's dance attendees likely receiving much of the focus. One of those attendees was the editor of the high school yearbook. Having the duty of presenting the class favourites who would grace the pages of that year's edition, she naturally would bump into Carla and Rodney and share a hello. Contact sheets of pictures in hand, a policeman, the school principal and the yearbook advisor asked for help identifying them and finding out which of them looked suspicious or out of place. It's through these events that slowly it began to sink in that what was happening was real. It wasn't long before news crews began to flock to Western Hills High, with Star Telegram and the now defunct Fort Worth Press disseminating articles and pictures of goings-on at the school. Much of the student body were overwhelmed by the media and scrutiny, and yet fixed to the television every evening at 6 and 10 PM for any update that came. The fact that this had even happened in the first place was enough. Many of the female students were frightened at the turn of events and in such close proximity. People began to think that if something like this could happen to a beautiful, popular, all-American girl like Carla, then it could happen to anyone. Just a few days earlier, school staff had shown their female students an instructional self-defence film that outlined the dangers that potentially awaited women as victims of physical and sexual assault, or even worse. If it weren't for the violence and social discord that the country already seemed to be embroiled in, the warning film lesson brought with it what would have almost seemed like a prediction instead. Parents, if they were already aware of what dangers could await their children, were extra vigilant with the fresh news of Carla's abduction, keeping tabs on them as they awaited to resume their normal carefree teenage lives. In hopes to encourage people to come forward with information on Carla's whereabouts, it didn't take long to establish a reward fund that collected largely from students both at the surrounding schools as well as Western Hills High. Law enforcement used the news to ask for the public's help in providing additional clues and evidence of Carla's whereabouts, and tips began pouring in by the hundreds. Phone calls came in to report all sorts of details, and this activity wasn't without its fair share of inaccurate information. At some times, it was an inaccuracy that was simply misguided, such as one of the many unconfirmed sightings of Carla that were reported. Other times, unfortunately, the inaccuracy was deliberately cruel. Rodney remembers the excitement Mr. Walker would feel every time someone called to inform them that they had Carla, or knew who did. Every time, it was just another meaningless prank. Despite that fact, there was still the possibility, even in the most unlikely of scenarios, that Carla could return. Whether it was by walking up the street or being kicked out of a vehicle into the front yard, or at the other end of a ransom demand, she could still come back home. It was for this reason that Cindy lay sleepless during those chilly nights following her sister's abduction. She recounted how she would spring up from the sofa to peer out of the window at every car that passed by, anticipating that one of them would contain Carla. But just as the approach of each new car brought with it a flicker of hope, it would quickly pass to leave further torment in its wake. During what would be described as the most massive police effort in Fort Worth up until that point, the Fort Worth Police, the Benbrook Police and the Tarrant County Sheriff's Office put officers out in droves, with many working for hours beyond their shifts. Around the clock, family, friends and students from the Western Hills High School and other schools searched the city to countryside and everywhere else in between. In the meantime, horse-mounted officers would survey every inch of Benbrook Lake, which was located less than 10 miles from the Walker residence. What must have felt like an eternity of waiting for Carla Walker's family and friends finally ended in full-blown tragedy 3.5 days after her abduction. On the evening of Wednesday, February 20th, 1974, 2 Fort Worth patrol officers were sent to follow up on a recent tip that was anonymously called in. The officers took turns scouring a particular location east of Highway 377 near Benbrook Lake, despite a thorough but fruitless search having been conducted there 2 days prior. Just 1 mile east of the highway, at a specific point along Holiday Park Lane as it was then called, they ultimately stopped the vehicle. This was to examine a concrete cattle culvert, a structure that allowed for the passage of cattle under intercepting roads. This particular culvert was located in an inclined bit of land just beyond a barbed wire fence. The officer whose turn it had been to survey the area had caught a glimpse of an unusual find lying in the muddy culvert. When he realised he was gazing upon the partially clothed human body, he knew immediately that the search for Carla had finally ended. Not long after the officers called in the discovery on a payphone, nearly 24 Benbrook, Fort Worth and Tarrant County officers began to seal off a large chunk of land in hopes of warding off any outside disturbance as they began their investigation of the scene. Carla was found wearing a blue dress with white trim, the same one she had borrowed from Cindy and which her mother had so carefully tailored to her petite figure to enjoy her Valentine's dance in. It was now ragged and covered in dirt and mud. Still intact were her bra, a watch, a bracelet, and 2 rings, one topaz and one to commemorate the graduation that wasn't to come. On Carla's head, face, neck and legs there was bruising. The cold February air would make it difficult to pin down an exact time of death at this point, and by the end of the evening, Carla's body was transported to the morgue at the All Saints Hospital. Despite law enforcement doing their best to skirt the media in reporting the discovery of Carla's body, they managed to reach Carla's parents first before anyone else, having heard the news on the police scanner. When Mrs. Walker heard the doorbell ring, she was greeted unceremoniously by the reporter's question about what she thought about them finding Carla, and then the announcement that she was murdered. The police showed up not long after. That evening, Leighton and Charlene were called to the morgue to provide visual identification of her body. The Walkers arrived at the morgue with Carla's brother Jim and with the support of another couple whom they regarded as their closest friends. The Walkers didn't have to see their daughter's body to know it was her. They knew it was her by her jewellery alone. After an eternity of several days, their worst fears were realised. Public funeral services and visitation for Carla were held on Friday the 22nd of February at Western Hills Church of Christ, which was packed to more than twice its capacity with those friends, family, schoolmates and other members of the community looking to pay their last respects. Most, if not all, of Western Hills High School was in attendance, with some students having recalled being traumatised by the experience and even swore off attendance to such ceremonies in the future. The white casket with gold and pink trim was left open as per Mr. Walker's request. In it, Carla lay in a graceful white and pink dress, a sight that every guest was sure to behold, seemingly whether they wanted to or not. Amongst those grieving were police officers hoping to get a glimpse of anyone who looked out of place. The circulation of the crowd was designed so that every guest was directed out of the church only first after filing past Carla's casket. This gave officers a way to scan the entire crowd for suspicious characters before leaving the premises. After leaving the church, the procession followed the casket to Greenwood Memorial Park, where at approximately 2 p.m, Carla Jan Walker was finally laid to rest. The moment they succumbed to the realisation that Carla was truly gone, the dynamics of the Walker family, the way they lived and gathered, changed permanently. They simply couldn't imagine an existence without Carla. Cindy simply couldn't imagine a wedding without Carla, who was slated to be her maid of honour just 3 months later. Holidays and family functions were filled with the sadness only made deeper as they imagined the pain and suffering Carla surely was subjected to. The only way to block out the grisly details of her ordeal was to keep their minds focused on the fond memories of her. Carla's brother Jim recounts the profound suffering his parents went through. Leighton had experienced the hell of World War II, but nothing compares to having to bury your own child, especially a second child. Having already lost her baby Sharon in a car crash 20 years earlier, and without the resources for grief support that we take for granted today, the renewed pain would be silent, but immense. Jim also recalls his mother Charlene falling into chronic and clinical depression for the next few years, and himself has admitted to succumbing to bitterness